David, it's great to see you today.
Good to be with you, Jason.
David, a lot of people think that Vladimir Putin became a criminal and a monster only on February 24th, 2022, when he launched the full scale invasion of Ukraine. But you well enough know, and you've written plenty of books that have shown that Vladimir Putin is a bloodthirsty monster going back decades. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. The Putin made his career in St. Petersburg, working closely with organized crime, especially the Tambov criminal organization and its leader, Mikhail Kumarin, who was also known as the night governor of St. Petersburg. The Tambov criminal organization was exceptionally vicious. They specialized in contract killings. They terrorized the entire city, but at the same time, they were in fact de facto rulers of St. Petersburg. And the reason for that was that because they were the preferred business partners of the city administration, and the person who was in fact running the city administration was Vladimir Putin. Anatoly Sobchak was well known as the mayor of St. Petersburg, but he was mostly interested in public appearances. The person who actually made the decisions, who collected the bribes, who conferred and mediated between the criminal organizations, that was Vladimir Putin. And we often hear that Russia is a mafia state. We hear it now. I mean, people have come to that inevitable conclusion, although it took them some time. But even that phrase, mafia state, doesn't really capture the depravity, because we think in terms of our own homegrown Italian American mafia, for example, or even the Italian mafia, which operated, I don't want to exaggerate this, but up to a point, or at least claimed to operate according to some type of rules. They didn't like it, and in fact could even punish when innocent people were killed or when family members were killed. Russian mafia has none of those limitations. You have to bear in mind that the Russian mafia didn't come out of a Christian country where there's a sense of right and wrong, and there's still the imagery of moral behavior. Uh, they are products of the Soviet system, in which the human being is treated simply as disposable material, and they acted accordingly. For the Russian mafia to kill family members is first of all, there's no compunction about doing that, but it's also considered to be absolutely useful because it inspires terror. We've seen a whole series of killings that have taken place in the months and years since the second phase, the full-scale phase of the war against Ukraine was launched. Certainly, a number of those cases, the businessman who was killed, or the person who had access to assets who was killed alongside of his wife and children. Uh, this is not unusual for the Russian mafia, and it reveals really the difference even in among elements of organized crime. The Russian mafia is as depraved as you can get, and Putin is a product of that environment. He worked with them, cooperated with them, and needless to say, protected them. He was their business partner. He himself was under criminal investigation for bribery and corruption when Yeltsin chose him as his successor. He was chosen specifically in order to protect the corrupt Yeltsin family. And it was clear that he was suitable because the operation known as Operation Successor that made it possible to protect Yeltsin and brought Putin to power was based, as we know, or as I've tried to explain for literally 25 years, was based on a terrorist act carried out by the regime against their own people.
So, David, Many people try to understand Russia through the prism of the United States. If you're an American, you think that other people think like Americans. We think that the Russians think like Europeans. They're different, but they're very similar. And so there's an expectation that they have similar objectives. The American president, whoever he is, does try to advance America's interest. And the assumption being that the Russian president advances Russia's interest. And so when we hear things, as we commonly do, from whether it's Putin or other people who speak on his behalf, such as Dmitry Medvedev today and the very bombastic statements that he makes, there's an expectation that they're doing it because they really care about Russia. And so when they say that when ATACMS are used by Ukraine, that's crossing a red line, or and that might turn nuclear, or when the West does something to provoke Russia, like allowing NATO to expand, because there had been promises, they allege, and it's never been proven, that there was promises that NATO would not expand, then they are forced into taking action. But the fact is, isn't it just really a criminal gang that's seeking to expand its influence globally? It's really a lot less about Russia and much more about personal interest. What do you see in it?
Russia needed, when the Soviet Union fell, it needed a kind of moral perestroika, which never took place. It didn't need to, it needed to transform the economic structures, and it did that. But it needed to do so within the framework of the rule of law. And it and only the rule of law was capable of generating an alternative consciousness in Russia. I mean, in the Soviet period, the Soviet Union was the first country in human history to have been based on atheism, and it introduced a set of negative values, because in the vacuum that atheism created, the communists deified the state. And when the state is deified, then there's no universal standard of morality that applies to the state as well. On the contrary, whoever represents the state is considered to be right by definition. This was kind of processed in people's minds and inculcated as reflecting the theory of class values. In other words, morality is nothing but, right and wrong, the Ten Commandments. That's nothing but the morality of the ruling class. But the victorious proletariat, which is the class in effect of the whole people, according to their theory, has its own morality, and whatever serves that morality is in fact right, and not subject to considerations of universal right and wrong, which basically is the essence of the Western tradition. Well, when the Soviet Union fell, the first thing that had to be jettisoned was this notion of class morality. And the only way to do that, to inculcate the notion in people that might doesn't make right, and that there's a standard of right and wrong that is applicable to everyone, was to create the conditions for the rule of law. Well, that was never done. I mean, the so-called reformers who took over in Russia were concerned. They were not concerned. They didn't have time for the law. They didn't have time for morality. They had only time to transform the economic system. So what you got in Russia was a criminal capitalism. And the rule of criminals could only be guaranteed through acts of terror. So that's where Putin came in. Under these circumstances, the only thing that can really shock Russia into a reevaluation of its values, which is what the country genuinely needs, is defeat in the present war.
A lot of people have observed that Russia's moral values, well, it's very hard to understand who their allies are based on that. I mean, you have on one side Iran, which is theocracy. On the other side, you have China, which is communistic in nature. And you have North Korea, which is just a horrible dictatorship. But they all have something in common, which is that they're autocracies. Those dictators wish to stay in power, and they're not willing to part with it. And so globally, I think there's an argument to be made. There's a lot of reasons why they're allied, not only because they have similar political systems and that they suppress their populations, but because the current global order, one that's rules based, is something that doesn't really serve their purposes. These nuances, where they hear all the time from the West, especially about human rights, democracy, freedom, it doesn't interest them. And they think that they're past that. And they have higher objectives. And that's why I think that they have a common interest in defeating Ukraine, which is a democracy. Because if they can defeat it there, and the West does not step up and does nothing and allows a democracy to be crushed, that shows very well that they might be on the right path. The path of these autocracies uniting against the West and against Western values. And in fact, Ukraine would only be the first step of a much larger war. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's basically it. The thing is, even communism and Marxism, Leninism, it was an elaborate theory, but at its core, it was a rejection of morality. Uh, the Marxism was supposedly a perfect science. It took the place of religion, and religion based on a transcendental point of reference, uh, establishes the value of all people and the rights of all people and a standard of morality that applies to all people. But on the Marxism, Leninism, which claimed to be perfect science, and which could be interpreted only by a small elite group, supposedly elite group, uh, uh, had neither the interest nor the ability to accept the rights of all people. Uh, it was something that had to be imposed, and under those circumstances, there was simply uh, no issue except power. What you had was a theory that was sufficiently persuasive for a number of people to get them to reject the moral heritage of the West. And when we talk about these authoritarian states, North Korea, Iran, China, Russia, what they all have in common is that all of them want to throw off the restraints of genuine universal morality embodied in the institutions of the West and in the culture of the West. Now, of course, they do it in various ways. The Iranians, for example, claim to be propagating pure Islam, or at least as they understand it. North Koreans are proponents of Marxism, Leninism in their own version, and the Chinese, despite the fact that they have a more or less market economy, also claim to be Marxist Leninists. But what they say is less important than the fact that these are all uh, authoritarian, terroristic regimes, which are interested in these various doctrines which they promulgate, not because the doctrines themselves mean anything, but simply because this is an excuse. This gives them to excuse an excuse to act as if they are the ultimate authority, and any limits on their drive for power, uh, you uh, are justifiably crushed.
So, David, all these countries, all of our enemies, are united. We have Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China, all of which are working against the West. But at this point, they're waging war against Ukraine. What's going on there? What's the deeper picture?
The role of Ukraine in all this uh, is clear. Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire, was subsumed by the large part of Ukraine was, not all of it, various times. The It was part of the Soviet Union. Ukrainians and Russians, despite everything, have a great deal in common. There are many Russians have spent part of their lives in Ukraine, and vice versa. Many Ukrainians lived for a time in what is now Russia. There are many families in Russia that are of Ukrainian descent, and vice versa. These two nations are very close to each other in many ways. But the anti values of Russia that have been imposed on Ukraine were catastrophic for Ukraine throughout its history. I mean, the greatest example, of course, is the Holodomor. But there were, the Great Terror, well, everything, begin through the whole history, beginning with the Red Terror, the Great Terror, the Holodomor, the devastation of the Second World War, the Stalinist repressions after the war, the famine after the war. Ukraine as an independent country based not on Russian anti-values, but on genuine universal values to which the country was very attracted, would never have endured all these horrors. It would have been a very different kind of country. So, association with Russia, domination by Russia for Ukraine has been a centuries-long tragedy. What we see now as the world rejects communism, as it rejects authoritarianism in the advanced parts of the world, is the attempt of a Slavic nation to break away from the domination of its neighbor and choose the path of civilization. And that can only have the effect of undermining the tyranny that exists in Russia itself, because there are enough people in Russia, despite as as brainwashed as they may be, as victimized by an imperial psychology as they may be, will nonetheless recognize in the person of a prospering democratic Ukraine an alternative path for Russia itself. And an alternative path for Russia itself, although it will be a blessing for the Russian people, is absolutely unacceptable for the criminals who run the country now. And it's one of the things that could break that connection between them and the Russian people. They use the country's chauvinism, they use its imperial psychology, they use its lack of respect for human rights and the individual. But their hold on power is not guaranteed if Russians, who, after all, have many talented people, although, of course, as we know, many have fled the country, begin to think seriously about their own destiny and have the ability to look to Ukraine as an example of what Russia could be. So, in a way, it's kind of like an ideological struggle carried out within the confines of the territory that was once the Soviet Union, between those forces in that territory that are Western looking, that want to bring about change, that want to do away finally with the curse of these alternative values and absurd system of false ideas, and the other part of the country, which is ruled by a criminal clique, which is desperate to hold on to power and will do anything it can to prevent the psychological change in Russia that's necessary, and that Ukraine is able to inspire.
David, as a Russia hand, somebody who spent their whole life studying the country, you must look around when you're in the US and see there's a lot about Russia that people just don't get. What do you think is one of the most important takeaways you would impart to somebody who doesn't know much about Russia?
It's now, against that background, we have the United States that's worried about gas prices, about spending money, although we aren't even spending anything, compared to the resources of the country, that has been propagandized to some extent, and which knows nothing about Ukraine, knows nothing about Russia, and needs desperately to be informed about what is at stake here. Because, as you pointed out, if Ukraine's aspirations are crushed, it gives a new lease on life to all of these forces, all of these countries. And Russia has been transformed even since February 2022 into a war machine. The level of chauvinistic propaganda and war hysteria inside the country is really something that has not been seen even since the days of the Soviet Union. And that kind of machine is not going to just peacefully accept Ukraine as a partner in NATO, or worse yet, non-NATO Ukraine arming itself in self-defense. It will react aggressively. We face a critical moment now with Trump coming into office. We have to hope, and I hope that we will have the means to impress on the people around him just how important it is that a democratic and aspiring Western country like Ukraine, with its resources and talent and amazing courage, is not abandoned, because the sheer fact of having of abandoning a country like that will reverberate throughout the whole world and have an effect on the standing of the West, on the standing of the United States. It's something that just can't be allowed to happen. And all of this talk about Ukraine not being our business, that Ukraine is that we are tired of the war. It's really surrealistic that people who have not, a nation that has not lost a single soldier, has not incurred the slightest inconvenience, is experience fatigue over the attempt of an allied nation to defend its nationhood and integrity. And we need to be very, very careful about demonstrating total cynicism and materialism and manipulation, and forsaking the values that in fact underpin the West. Those values are the keystone for everything. If we show that what we really care about is only our material well-being, which in fact isn't even affected very much, if at all, we will undercut just the basis of our own moral existence. It's not a joke what's happening. So we just have to do what we can.
David, that is really interesting. Those are some great answers, and there's still so many more that I'd love to give you. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Jason.